Welcome back to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I'll be the host again. With us again is Michael Zacchea, Lieutenant Colonel, retired from the Marine Corps. Michael Zacchea, who was, just to brief you on his background, he was part of the expedition in Black Hawk Down after that began. He was part of the group which trained Iraqi soldiers to defend their country after the fall of Saddam Hussein. And we were going to talk a little bit about, well, let's start off with torture. We're going to get around to the training of Iraqi forces and what worked and what didn't. But let's start with something a little bit more pressing at the moment, something a little bit more in the news, and that's the notion of torture that went on from 2002 to 2009, and what's your take on that?
Thanks for having me, David. I was one of the first and highest ranking officers to come out against what I consider to be a felonious policy of torture in 2009. I actually made a public service announcement for a alliance between the Alliance for Justice and the ACLU, speaking out against
American Civil Liberties Union. Yep.
Speaking out against this felonious torture policy. And it is felonious. During my career, I attended and graduated from the Law of Land Warfare course at the Naval War College. And part of our training was we learned what are war crimes, and very specifically waterboarding and some of the other things that were done by the CIA and that were authorized by the Bush National Command Authority. Were violations of, were war crimes that I learned. Unfortunately, I really believe that this has been a tremendous, and I think that our nation has been stained. It will take, if ever, decades to overcome the shame and the stain of what we have done, not just to enemy prisoners of war, but to innocent people, to people that were mistakenly taken into custody, to people that
were never charged,
to people that our nation tortured just because we wanted to see if they didn't know anything. So this has been a real, and you know, a lot of people have criticized people who come out against this policy as being weak on national defense, or they offer as an excuse, well, they did it to us, or we have to be tough, or, you know, in my battalion, so I was the senior advisor to the first Iraqi Army battalion trained by U.S. military and led in combat. And in the 8 months that I led them in combat, we had 6 Iraqi soldiers that were abducted and beheaded. 5 that were abducted and tortured and their bodies dumped in our area where we could find them to frighten the other soldiers. And we had tremendous incentive to retaliate in kind. And I would not let the Iraqis respond that way. And when people say that, I say, well, you know, we're not Iraqis, and we don't live by a code of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You know, just because they do it to us doesn't mean that we have license to do it to them. The other part of it is that our military is absolutely strong enough and capable enough to respond with an appropriate level of violence to terrorists without resorting to the use of torture. Either as a punitive measure or as a measure for gathering intelligence.
Not to be terrorists themselves.
Correct.
Well, it's interesting to note, but in apparently in the when the CIA was torturing these folks, as you noted, many of which had never been charged with a crime, and in fact they had to admit were not guilty of any crime, even though they had tortured them in an attempt to find out whether they knew anything. A lot of our CIA officers refused to take part in that torture. And that's their right as a soldier or an officer is told by a higher up to do something that they know to be incorrect according to what they're trained to do, they do have the right to refuse. And apparently a lot of the CIA officers chose to refuse to follow those instructions to torture people. And kudos to them for that.
In the military, we are constantly trained that we have an obligation to disobey an unlawful order. So, I believe that the policy was unlawful. But here's what they did. So they created plausible deniability among the three elements. So you have the policymakers, you have the law people, and you have the implementers. So the policymakers go to the law people, who are John Bybee, Bybee and you. I can't remember the first name.
Alberto Gonzalez amongst them?
Yeah. And they say, can you give us a reading or an opinion about this? And they give the opinion that was cooked, it was predetermined, that yes, you can do these things. And their plausible deniability is it's never illegal to give an opinion. We can give an opinion and we can't be prosecuted for giving an opinion, right? So then the policymakers say, well, we were acting on the best legal policy advice that we had, so we believe that. So
they being the Bush administration?
Right, so we can't be held responsible for it. And then, the implementers, these contractors who, scam, and this is another thing, the $80 million from these two psychologists, this was a scam. This, aside from the illegality of what they did, the fact that they got an $80 million no-bid contract to do this is a corruption and a scandal itself, and nobody's talked about that. But they can say, well, we got this contract from the National Command Authority, and we were just fulfilling, and we had every reason to believe it was legal, so you can't cut. And there's a principle in law that says when you're acting under, a contractor is acting under blanket of national security or not, liable for those acts. And that a lot of weird things come out of that.
So they're all kind of leaning on the guy next to him. Everybody,
yes, that's correct.
They form a circle, and everybody leans on the guy to the left of him and said, well, the guy to the left of me said it was okay.
Right.
Then the guy to the left of him says, well, the guy to the left of him says it's okay. It's all, they're all creating an illusion of what we didn't know.
Correct.
And so this torture went on, and we know a lot of what went on. We know that there were not just a few people tortured, that it was into the well over 100 people, many of whom that we know in retrospect did not do anything that they were asked about, did not have any information to give up, except the information that they gave up just as an attempt to, hey, I'll tell you whatever you want, just stop torturing me.
Well, have you read about the one guy who came to the CIA to say, I have this information, and they misunderstood what he was saying, and they, case is mistaken, but they thought that he was captured on the battlefield, and they wound up detaining and torturing him as well, even though he was actually an informant. So aside from the felonious nature of this, it was poorly run, it was inept, and it was the contract was scandalous. It was corrupt. So there's a lot to this that has not been explored.
What's the roots of the illegality of the waterboarding and all that? What did that evolve out of?
It actually goes back a long ways. So originally, we know that in the Geneva Convention that it is specifically by name prescribed in the Geneva Convention as a war crime. But before the United States was signatory to the Geneva Convention, and because the United States is signatory to the Geneva Convention, it has all the force of law in our country. So it is law in our country. In World War II, Japanese and German war criminals were prosecuted for the use of waterboarding against enemy prisoners of war.
Americans amongst them.
Yes. And even before that, in the Spanish-American War, a famous Marine major named Littleton Waller used what they called the water cure against Muslim insurgents on the Moro Island in the Philippines.
Oh, because that's a lot of Muslims live in the Philippines.
Yes, and during the Spanish-American War, the Marines were fighting Muslim insurgents in the Philippines, and it was a famous, among Marines, famous crazy battle called the March in Samar. But this famous guy, hard guy, very brutal guy named Littleton Waller, used what he's called the water cure on Philippine Muslim insurgents, and he wound up being court-martialed and convicted at court-martial of doing this. So even in 1900 or so, it was considered a crime. It's also a crime in the civilian code. So in the 1980s, a sheriff in Texas used waterboarding against civilians who he arrested to extract confessions from, and that sheriff was ultimately convicted. So both in the military law and civilian law, waterboarding, certainly rectal feeding, and some of these other things are torture.
So it's pretty universally recognized then that that all these things are patently illegal.
Yes.
So where did the Bush administration get their notion that they weren't?
They basically made it up. Dick Cheney said, in the week after 9/11, we're going to go to the dark side, and everybody willingly went with it. And he made no bones about it. He said, "We're going to the dark," like out of
Darth Cheney.
out of Star Wars, we're going to the dark side, and come along with me. And Americans were so afraid and so traumatized that they went. Nobody said, "Hey, wait a minute,"
They used our fear against us.
Yeah.
And fear is a powerful tool to get your way to do some awful things.
Yeah, and the best thing you can say about Dick Cheney is that he didn't try to.
He didn't hide it.
Yeah.
He was right up front with it.
Yeah, but we need to examine who we are as a country and say, are we a country that is going to say, yeah, we're an empire and we're going to torture people at will, and character doesn't count.
Now, after World War II, of course, there were trials held. Yeah. And since the Germans and the Japanese, they were on the losing side, the trials were principally for them. But a lot of their soldiers and civilians were found guilty of conducting torture. And as I understand, a lot of those people that were convicted of torturing, they were executed.
Yes, they were. I can't say with any authority, that this crime met this punishment. So
I'm not implying that I think the CIA agents that conducted this torture should be executed. But, well, they got their orders from somewhere. I don't blame them nearly as much as I do the people that told them to do what they did, the higher ups, the legal angle, the Justice Department of Alberto Gonzales, and the George W. Bush, Dick Cheney administration that told them directly to do that. And some of the CIA agents said, no, it's illegal, we're not going to do it, and they were fine. They weren't punished for that because they were following the law of our military. But the ones that did were given those orders by the higher ups, by Dick Cheney, George Bush, Alberto Gonzales. Where do they stand in all of this? There have been talks about holding criminal war crime trials somewhere in the world and reaching out and trying to get them as the leaders that instigated this horrific behavior and actually trying them. In fact, some I think Spain has
Spain has indicted
indictment out against George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, that if they ever actually set foot on Spanish soil, they're liable to be arrested.
I know that the UN has called for prosecution. I think that certainly the policymakers are vulnerable to international prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they probably won't be able to travel internationally. So for whatever that's worth, they may not want to. But I think that this is going to be I personally prefer to think that this is going 50 years from now. Historians and people are going to look back at this past decade of our history and say, what the heck were they thinking? What the heck happened? And I like to think that historically it will be an aberration.
Do you think it'll be looked upon as harshly as what the Nazis and what the Japanese did?
I do, unfortunately. Although Gore Vidal said that something about the United States, he called the United States of amnesia, but I think that historians will in the future and look at this episode and these crimes with the same neutral contempt that they would look at crimes, and not just the Nazis and the Japanese, but I should also say that the way that these two psychologists came up with this regime that they sold to the CIA for $80 million, they re-engineered torture from reports of American prisoners of war from the Korean War who were interred by North Koreans. And this is what the North Koreans did to them. And it was re-engineered, backwards engineered to do that. So basically we're learning, or not we, but the contract torturers that the CIA hired learned their stuff from North Koreans. So I don't know what that says about about us and about the CIA.
So what was said in the cartoon Pogo, we have met the enemy and he is us, kind of pretty accurate in this case.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, on to a more cheerful subject. Okay, 2006.
Yeah.
Iraq is degenerated pretty much into a civil war.
Yes.
Take us to 2006